Hello, friends. Today I want to read a manuscript, sorry, not a manuscript, a completed book in PDF form, uh, 50 Years of Japanese at Cambridge, 1948 to 1998, a chronicle with reminiscences compiled and edited by Professor Richard Bowring. Um, Professor Bowring is an emeritus professor of Cambridge University where he taught Japanese studies and researched the same. And he was also master of Selwyn College, I think from 2000 to 2013. I believe he retired in 2014. Anyway, I've recently been in touch with him to get his permission to read from another book, Japanese Studies in Britain. He wrote a chapter for that. And he mentioned in passing that this PDF exists and is still available for download on the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies website at Cambridge University. And so I have indeed downloaded it. I've known about it for quite a long time, and I propose to read from it today. I don't know how far I shall get, but it's 76 pages, so it's quite long. We'll see how we go today. Before I do that, quickly share a photograph, I think from 2017, of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge, which is on the Sidgwick site. I've never actually been to the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, although I did study at the Sidgwick site in my first year in 1975 to 6, because I was reading Modern and Medieval Languages, French and German, Part 1. And I have quite fond memories of getting on my bicycle with a front basket and charging down King's Parade with several fellow students to make it in time for the 9 o'clock lectures. So it was really the 9 o'clock lecture rush, I think it was called. So those are good memories of Sidgwick site, and also translation classes there with, I think it was Professor Austin is one of the people I remember. All right. So I shall stop sharing that, and I shall move over to sharing the PDF, which I propose to read from now. Okay. So here we are, 50 Years of Japanese at Cambridge, 1948 to 1998, a chronicle with reminiscences, compiled and edited by Richard Bowring. Copyright, Faculty of Oriental Studies, University of Cambridge, 1998. Contents, Preface, Introduction, The Early Days, 1947 to 55, by William E. Skillend. Reminiscences of Cambridge by Donald Keene, a famous American whom I have actually met. I think he's passed away now. The Next 30 Years by Carmen Blacker. On the Receiving End in the 1960s by Richard Bowring. A memoir by Douglas Mills, and Chronicle of the Years 1984 to 97 by Richard Bowring. Then we have Japanese Libraries and Books in Cambridge by Peter Kornitsky. Japanese Students in Cambridge During the Meiji Era by Koyama Noboru. And I actually translated his full book on that subject. Koyama-san's full book on that subject. Academic staff appointments, Japanese lectors, PhDs awarded, undergraduates by year of matriculation, and undergraduate numbers by year. Preface. This book has been created as a small celebration of a not insignificant milestone, and it is presented in the hope that it may be of interest not only to former students, present students, and Japanese who know Cambridge, but also to anyone who is curious to see how an initially unfamiliar new academic subject in the humanities can, with time and perseverance, be translated into the ranks of the accepted and the legitimate, even in a fairly conservative institution. It is designed to stand as a record, so the reader will find some rather dry lists that will be of immediate interest only to those who appear in them, but it also contains reminiscences by former lecturers, which should give some flavour of the personalities who contributed to the teaching and research that are the very reason for our continued existence. The picture that emerges is one of rather haphazard beginnings and eventual survival against considerable odds, but the celebration is genuine. The future is relatively secure, even in what is now an increasingly hostile financial environment. Moves are now afoot to create an East Asian Institute, where it is hoped that Japanese studies in Cambridge will find a new home, link itself fruitfully to other disciplines, and continue to grow and prosper. Well, I think it's now part of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. That's probably what the East Asian Institute idea has become, I suppose. As a first step, this book has been produced in-house. We welcome any additions to the record, either in the form of corrections or further reminiscences, and we intend to produce a second definitive edition in due course. Comments please to the editor, Faculty of Oriental Studies, Sidgwick Avenue, Cambridge, CB3 9DA. Okay. So I don't think this has ever been published except as a PDF on the website, as far as I know. And certainly Richard Bowring did not mention that it had been published in any other format. Introduction. To an outsider, the system that operates in Cambridge is largely a closed book. Much of what is written here is by insiders, and so assumes a prior knowledge of colleges, tripos, supervisions, specified texts, and the like. Former students will probably be at home with such vocabulary. I think I will be, but many others will need help. This very short description constitutes the bare minimum necessary to make sense of what follows. Cambridge is a collegiate university which works like a federal institution. Each college is an independent legal entity with its own foundation, rules, and buildings. Each college is governed by its fellows, most but not all of whom also hold appointments as teaching officers in the university. The student applies to a college rather than the university, and the college provides the student with accommodation, food, a home from home, and close academic supervision, often on a one-to-one basis. It is the university, however, that runs the examination system, and each college must enter its students for these examinations. It is therefore the role of the college to prepare the student for the exams and to monitor progress throughout the year. The examinations are known as the tripos and are usually split into preliminary to Part 1, and Part 2. The nomenclature may differ in different faculties, taken at the end of each academic year. Japanese used to be a 3-year course until 1986. Now, however, Part 1 is taken after 2 years of study and Part 2 after 4, with a mandatory period in Japan. Because the examinations and the teaching are separately administered, continuous assessment is still rare, and a series of 3-hour written tests are the norm. Information about which texts are to be examined must therefore be communicated to the student well in advance, hence the reference in what follows to lists of prescribed or specified texts. There are 3 terms, Michaelmas, Lent, and Easter. A student comes to Cambridge to read a subject, and the work is fairly specialized from the beginning. Such an approach offers great advantages in terms of depth, but it is predicated on the student already being fully educated in a general sense, a luxury that cannot now necessarily be taken for granted. There are in the system as a whole 3 kinds of teaching officer. 1, those who have a university appointment but no college fellowship. They give university lectures and classes and devote themselves to research. They have no direct involvement in college affairs, but may on occasion teach students from colleges in small groups for which they receive extra payment from the colleges. 2, those who have a university appointment and hold a college fellowship in addition. They sit on the college's governing body, and they may have a more substantial job within the college, such as tutor or director of studies. They are usually expected to participate in small group teaching for their own college and sometimes for other colleges as well, for which they may receive extra payment. 3, those who only hold a college appointment. They may be scholars working in academic fields for which a college may feel a specific need, or they may be research fellows. Their stipend comes entirely from college rather than university sources. Titles may differ from college to college. It is to distinguish such appointments from those held in the university that one finds the latter with the prefix university. The exact role of a college in a student's academic life will vary depending on the subject. Here we shall concentrate on the humanities. In English literature or history, for example, the university provides lectures and other classes in the faculty, but the decision as to whether or not to attend these lectures is up to the student and his or her academic advisor, known as a director of studies. Academic control is handled by this director of studies, and the student works largely via small group teaching, supervisions, which is usually organized by the college. The case of Japanese, however, is rather different. Because the student numbers university-wide are too low for the subject to be viable on a single college base, all teaching, both lectures and supervisions, is organized centrally by the faculty. The role played by the college is of necessity minor. This is rather an unusual situation in the Cambridge context. There is a drawback here. Since a college can buy in teaching on an hourly basis whenever the occasion arises, it rarely has the need to appoint a fellow in Japanese studies per se. Until recently, it was in fact most unusual for a teaching officer in such a subject to have a college fellowship. This had a knock-on effect on students' intake and affected the degree to which the academic concerned felt tied to the wider community. It is clear from Carmen Blacker's memoir that in the early years, Japanese, and indeed Oriental studies in general, was simply accommodated in a large house on what was then almost the outskirts of Cambridge. College affiliation was quite rare. In fact, she had to wait almost 10 years to be accepted by a college as a fellow, and then it was a college devoted to graduate students only. This may come as a surprise to former students whose own life would normally have revolved around their college and who are probably still unaware that it is possible to hold a university appointment without automatically being a fellow. Matters have improved recently, but it is still true to say that it remains difficult to obtain a college fellowship for a teacher of Japanese. The fact that one specializes from the very beginning at Cambridge means that an undergraduate can progress quickly, but by the same token it is difficult to provide proper training in both a difficult language and an academic discipline such as anthropology, history, or literary theory. Cross-faculty cooperation is increasing, but there is still a long way to go in this regard. Most students emerge with good language skills, but still need further training in a discipline before going into research. As the figures in this report will show, postgraduate numbers are still very low. The preface mentioned survival against considerable odds. Why such odds? One might expect here a tale of pure prejudice against an only just defeated enemy who had waged war with a ruthlessness that we had conveniently forgotten, but it is difficult to find any of this in the records. The truth is more prosaic, more a story of academic self-interest and the subtle influence of names and titles. When the study of Japan and Japanese finally became a legitimate subject in the university, it was placed within the Faculty of Oriental Languages. The faculty subsequently became renamed Oriental Studies in 1955, but it remained in essence devoted to the study of a wide range of non-European languages with heavy emphasis on the Middle East and India. The common thread here was an interest in philology and religion that ultimately went back to colonial and imperialist concerns. The only sensible bedfellow for Japan in such a context was China, but China itself was marginalized in such company. There were and are no separate departments within the faculty. As a new, unfamiliar subject with very few students indeed, Japanese was bound to find it a struggle, if not to survive, then to prosper. Power in faculties lies in the faculty board, and the constitution of the board is often crucial to a subject's well-being. Suffice it to say that during the 1950s and as late as the 1970s, this was a world in which when the board was asked to create a wish list of new posts, a lectureship in Ossetic, Sogdian, or ancient Iranian was liable to rank far higher than one in modern Japanese history, a situation that continued until the availability of outside funds allowed Japanese to expand on its own. It is not so much a matter of prejudice as of simple self-interest. To have Arabic, Hebrew, and Persian in the same faculty as Chinese and Japanese is rather like putting law in the same pot with economics. Since Oriental languages was an offshoot of the classics, Greek and Latin, and still tied to the discipline of philology, it is hardly surprising that the design of the earliest courses in Japanese was based on classical lines. This is why one finds first-year students in 1949 beginning with Taketori Monogatari and Tosa Nikki, and going on in the second year to the Manyoshu, Makura no Soshi, and finally having to tackle the Kojiki. As Donald Keene notes, the reading of modern Japanese was only introduced in haphazard fashion. We must not assume, of course, that this was simply a case of die-hard classicists ruling the roost. It was well-nigh impossible to obtain modern Japanese books at the time, and it is clear from Peter Kornitsky's account that the university library itself was of no help in this regard. In a letter dated 10th of June 1947 to Captain J. Clifford, who was stationed at the time in Kuala Lumpur and was to become one of the first students at Cambridge, Eric Keedle had occasion to write as follows. That's Keedle spelt C-E-A-D-E-L, but the C is a hard C. And he wrote as follows. I wonder if you have any contacts, official or unofficial, with anyone in Japan now who could help me get some Japanese books, mainly works of reference, dictionaries, and editions of the classics. I have tried 4 or 5 times to get some of these books by writing to people in Japan, mainly officers in the occupation forces, but with no success. If you know of any means to help me, I would be very glad. Keedle was the real founder of the subject at Cambridge, and it is entirely due to his subsequent efforts that the university library now contains the kind of Japanese collection that could never be built from scratch today, and without which none of us would have been persuaded to come and teach. Keedle had graduated in 1941 with first-class honours in classics and had already published 3 articles on metrical problems in Greek tragedy in Classical Quarterly while an undergraduate. In January 1942, he was posted to an army course in Japanese held at Bedford and was made instructor in November 1942, a position that he held until October 1945. During this period, over 200 selected men of university scholarship standard were taught a working knowledge of the written language in 6-month courses. He was appointed lecturer in Japanese at Cambridge in October 1947 and stayed in that position until he became university librarian 20 years later. He died in 1979, an early example of what is now known in Japan as karoshi, or death through overwork. We begin the series of reminiscences with those William Skillend, one of the first students of Japanese at Cambridge. Those of William Skillend. And here's a footnote after death through overwork. For more details of Keedle's life and achievements, see the foreword to Nozomi Hayashi and Peter Kornitsky, Early Japanese Books in Cambridge University Library, Cambridge University Press, 1991. All right, so then we have Early Days, 1947 to 55 by William E. Skillend. I had been awarded a scholarship in classics at that's Christ's College, in the spring of 1944. By the time I was able to take it up in October 1947, I knew that one was not bound to read the subject in which one had qualified, and I had lost much of my youthful enthusiasm for Latin and Greek. I had an open mind on what I might best read, and my tutor suggested that, since the army had trained me in Japanese, I might consider the course in that language which had just been instituted. My potential supervisor in the subject, Eric Keedle, was of my college, which no doubt felt some obligation to push what undergraduates it could in his direction. Why not? Keedle had been my principal teacher of Japanese in 1944, and I liked and greatly admired him. Reading Japanese would probably be at least as enjoyable and useful as classics as a way of passing the next 3 years. I know that with the intervening changes in the international alignment, the army had later given me some training in Slovene and Serbo-Croat, but that is or would have been another story. So I took the historic decision to become one of the first 2 students of Japanese at Cambridge. If I had realized the importance of that moment, I might have kept a detailed diary from which some useful contribution to this publication might have been made. 50 years on and far too deeply into retirement to do any serious research, I can only recollect haphazardly my impressions of that time, trusting that others may correct the more serious lapses of my lapses of memory. My fellow student in 1947 to 48 must, I think, now have been the J. Clifford mentioned by Richard Bowring. He had, if it were possible, an even more cavalier attitude towards his studies than I did, and we drifted out of touch with each other soon after graduation. Unless he can be found now, I may be the only living witness to the momentous events of 50 years ago. The thought is almost enough to persuade me not to put down in writing anything about it. So, to save tedious repetition, please allow me to suggest that readers add a qualifying clause to every sentence in this paper. My recollection is that, or if my fading memory is to be trusted. The specified text for the preliminary year in 1947-48 was a history of the First World War, and the only passage I can recall from it, perhaps it was set for translation in the examination, described a German attempt to bomb Sandringham. One can only wonder how this came to be selected as the text from which all Japanese studies at Cambridge would evolve. Was it perhaps the only book in Japanese in England at that time of which 3 or more copies could be obtained? However, for one whose previous experience in Japanese had been translating telegraph-style texts in romanji, written in horizontal lines from left to right, this book did make 2 basic points. First, that its title was on the back cover of the book, and one proceeded from there to read from the last page to the first in vertical columns arranged from right to left. And secondly, that to read the title, one needed the sort of deviousness of mind which only a training in Latin and Greek could give one, a mind which would happily tackle the Times crossword before breakfast. This title consisted of 4 Chinese characters in a square block. In the northwest quadrant was the character shu, end, in the northeast, shi, begin, and in the 2 southern quadrants, the character sen, war, twice. To meet the challenge of finding the title and of reading it, shisen, shusen, and to experience that thrill of enlightenment that this was the fiendishly Japanese way of expressing the war to end war, was to have made a very sound start on Japanese studies. There was now no looking back. Reading this book with no doubt other instructional material took 2 hours of class in the morning and 2 hours of preparation between tea and dinner most days during term time, leaving ample time for healthy recreation between lunch and tea and for social activities after dinner. The long 28 weeks of vacation could also be broken into manageable lengths by joining the mountaineering club in North Wales or the Lake District. I simply accepted that this was Cambridge as it was, ever had been, and always should be. The important thing was to get in. Once you were in, it really did not matter very much what you actually did. The contrast could not have been greater than that with my last previous period of academic work. Between 1940 and 1944, in the 6th form of my Liverpool grammar school, I had read the complete canons of Greek literature from Homer to Aristotle, and of Latin literature from Plautus to Suetonius. If that was classics, what a wise decision I had made to read Japanese. Cambridge 1947 was indeed a land fit for heroes to live in. The university was at the forefront of pure and applied science. It had invented and installed in every college room gas fires, which drew the heat out of a room and dispersed it out of the chimney without actually raising the temperature of the fenland air outside. The culinary art had been refined to its purest in college halls, as Donald Keene relates, and the British restaurant offered a choice for lunch every day. One could have either snook, or rock salmon, and either take or not take either or both the reconstituted dehydrated potatoes and the mushy peas. I think snook is whale meat, is it not? Anyway, then at no extra charge, one could carry one's tray to share a table with E.M. Forster. The only worry I had, fleetingly, for a few days early in the summer of 1948, was that perhaps I was not really bright enough to have finished the preliminary examination papers in rather less than half the time allotted for them. I need not have worried. My own subsequent experience of teaching Korean solo from scratch leads me to suspect that I probably knew as much Japanese as my teacher or examiner by the end of my first year. But I should not put myself on the same plane as Eric Keedle. His powerful brain was always under iron control, but his formal manner never quite managed to shield his students from his infectious enthusiasm for the subject, which he had taken upon himself to champion. In this connection, I can support, perhaps even upstage, Richard Bowring with his illustration of Keedle's character by his Ume no Hana story. 17 years earlier, in January 1949, I had presented Keedle with a sprouting crocus bulb wrapped in a tanka about the Yuki no Ma ni ide kuru wakana, which I was minded to offer to Kideru-sama. This is a tanka is a poem, short poem. I was inordinately proud of this and bitterly disappointed at Keedle's complete lack of reaction to it. The scene was exactly as described by Bowring, except that it was I who was nonplussed and unable to smile even ever so wanly. I was sure that Keedle was chiding me, not explicitly, he would never do that, but implicitly, as if I had broken some unwritten rule of a club. As is amply testified by other contributors to this publication, the second year of the course was one great leap forward into the Kokinshu and other texts of real as opposed to modern Japanese. Certainly it was the Kokinshu in the second year and the Meiyoshu in the third year for poetry. For prose, I am not sure now of what we read when, but over these 2 years, we certainly read at least parts of Taketori Monogatari, Makura no Soshi, and Genji Monogatari, plus, incredibly, some No and some Kanbun texts. Our attitude to this was that there was nothing that we could not do. I did not then, and now cannot know, what our teachers felt, but we students had no conception of the massive scholarship there was on all these works in Japan. We were the bold explorers, mapping accurately territory of which there had previously only been sketch maps drawn by the likes of Arthur Waley, who translated Genji Monogatari without ever going to Japan. I was not conscious that this attitude was arrogant and hoped that my naivete and immaturity may earn me some understanding of, if not forgiveness, for my arrogance. We were Cambridge, that is the best. There was simply no world outside Cambridge. Yes, of course, there was Oxford, but Oxford had no Japanese studies at all then. The Cambridge system always has been idiosyncratic and usually aloof, and there was one more peculiarly Cantabrigian twist at this time. The BA is generally taken as a mark of some academic achievement, even if nowadays only a qualification for proceeding to higher academic achievement in an MA or PhD. Not so in Cambridge, at least not in 1949. BA, after one's name, simply showed that one had reached a minimum level of maturity, that one was no longer in statu pupillari. One practical effect of this was that one was no longer restricted, as undergraduates were, presumably for their own moral well-being, to living in college or in licensed lodgings. Cambridge had a problem at this time, with many returning ex-servicemen taking up places offered to them up to 5 or 6 years earlier, joining those who were currently being offered places directly from school, colleges and licensed lodgings were bursting at the seams. Part of the university's solution to this problem was to award BA degrees not at the conclusion of one's tripos course, but a given number of years after matriculation, that is, after qualifying for entry to the university. I had matriculated in 1944, and so after taking part 1 only, I was awarded by BA in 1949. I suppose that I might have gone out into the world as BA in Japanese, and after the lapse of the further statutory number of years would have been MA in Japanese, having read only selected parts of Shisen Shusen, Kokinshu, and Taketori Monogatari. That I in fact went further with my studies was in part due to the companionship I had with Jeff Sargent, with whom I shared unlicensed lodgings for a couple of years. He had taken part 1 in classics, but switched to Japanese for part 2 in 1948. thus becoming the first real graduate in Japanese in 1949. Jeff had a sincere attitude towards his studies, tempered by a healthy sense of humor. After finishing his PhD, he went on to a useful career in Japanese in Australia, and it was a loss to us all that he died so young. I'm just thinking about my father as I read this because he was at Oxford around the same time as this, and he completed a modern languages degree in normally one which would take 3 years in 2 years, having taken part, well, in uniform, at least in the war. More important to me, however, was Keedle's encouragement. He recommended me for a Scarborough scholarship early in 1950, and I cannot deny that the increase of grant which this gave me from something like £200 a year as an undergraduate to £300 as a postgraduate was one factor in my growing commitment to academic life. At exactly what stage this commitment became firm and irrevocable, I cannot now say, but I think that by the end of my third year, I was sure that I wanted to, was convinced that I was able to establish the long envisaged relationship on the Indo-European model between the vocabularies of Japanese and other Altaic languages. My research centered on the Manyoshu, and the eventual aim of it was to compile a vocabulary of the earliest ascertainable state of the Japanese language as it could be firmly attested by hard scrutiny of the texts. This work was delayed in its later stages when Keedle told Jeff Sargent and me that he had been totally disappointed in his hopes to expand Japanese studies at Cambridge. He advised me to apply for the lectureship in Korean, which was to be established at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. University of London, yes. In 1953, I had been learning Korean there from a visiting professor from Korea for nearly 2 years, and I did get the post. It was envisaged at the time that I would divide my time equally between Korean and Japanese, and a rather low load of Korean teaching allowed me time to finish my thesis by 1955. That thesis, though entitled The Vocabulary of the Manyoshu, actually only set out how I had established the methods by which such a vocabulary might be compiled. Although I continued for some years to compile that vocabulary, I became discouraged from completing and publishing it for a number of reasons. One was certainly that there seemed to be no one I could easily associate with who had a similar interest in the subject and who could stimulate me or evaluate my work. In contrast, the help and guidance in Korean studies which I immediately received from Korean scholars during and after my sabbatical year in Korea in 1955-56, allied to the quickly growing demand for the teaching of Korean at SOAS, encouraged me strongly to give more, eventually all of my time, to Korean. Then my growing awareness of the work done in Japan on the history of its language and comparative philology eventually became more of a handicap than a help in two different ways. Typical of one was my introduction to the work of Ono Susumu. At first, I was greatly comforted that he had reached in his public works the same conclusions on the language of the Manyoshu that I had reached in ignorance of his work. But later, though I was pleased to establish a good personal relationship with him in Japan in 1956, I could not but be disillusioned by his subsequent conclusions on the relationship between the vocabularies of Japanese and various unlikely languages of Southeast Asia. On the other hand, other Japanese scholars seemed to be sounder in their conclusions, but when I saw that even the best informed, best disciplined, and most responsible of these, such as Kono Rokuro, still could not establish any systematic relationship between the vocabularies of Japanese and Korean, I came to doubt whether even the most brilliant MA PhD Cantab had any hope of doing so. Cantab being Cambridge. Okay. In the end, however, it was the results of my own efforts at comparative philology which extinguished my enthusiasm for the work. I had occasional achievements of the apparently impossible, such as establishing a roundabout relationship between Japanese na and Korean irum, name, but overall I only succeeded in proving the rightness of the aphorism often attributed to Voltaire that comparative philology is a branch of language study in which consonants count for very little and vowels for nothing at all. Even stricter application of my logic to the phonemic systems of Japanese at its various stages within the Manyoshu produced a list of words formed for comparative purposes of only 3 types of consonants combined into syllables with only two types of vowels. With such an abstract system, it was hardly ever difficult to find for a Japanese word a similarly structured word in Korean with a close enough meaning to that of the Japanese word to make a match. Distressingly, it proved equally easy to find a matching Chinese word also, even in many cases a suitably matching Indo-European word. I was probably at this stage when I was at Columbia University for a year, during which I had close contact with Goren Malmquist, who had found his historical study of Chinese stymied by the nature of its script, and with Sir George Sansom, who totally dismissed historical linguistics as of any importance at all for the future of Japanese studies. My card index of my vocabulary of Proto-Japanese was last seen in the loft of my previous house. That is, it has not been seen for over a quarter of a century. I see that this is becoming far too much of my personal story. Perhaps I could return to the subject of early Japanese studies at Cambridge by going back to the point at which I left Cambridge for London. One of the reasons for that was that I wished to learn Korean, but another was the dearth in Cambridge of authorities in fields which are now commonly related to Japanese studies. Or perhaps rather that Japanese studies, being interpreted very much as the study of ancient Japanese texts, were not yet in a state to take advantage of the expertise that there was in other disciplines. Of course, there were, famously, economists at Cambridge, but no one thought before 1950 of studying the Japanese economy systematically. Ron Dorr in London was in the preliminary stages of his study of Japanese society, but the hallowed precincts of Cambridge would not have tolerated at that time the presence of a sociologist. Most importantly for me, there was no linguistics or phonetics, such as there was in plenty in London, which would take account of Japanese. The nearest to linguistics there was Professor Jobson's course on Indo-European philology. That was both entertaining and informative. It was said that Professor Jobson was fluent in 14 languages, 13 of them dead languages. Cambridge rejoiced in its wealth of such characters verging on the eccentric, and even in Japanese, a very esoteric subject compared with such core subjects as Indo-European philology, all the teachers were people of talent and character. Donald Keene joined us in 1948, as he relates, and it seems incredible now that we took so little advantage of his unique ability to convey to Westerners the essence of Japanese literature, though we did benefit from the touch of reality which he brought to the language teaching. He also performed, as again he relates, one pivotal role. Having actually set foot in Korea during his Navy service, he had learned 2 words of Korean. He offered to teach a small group of us both of these words, and in fact went on to unravel for us the mysteries of Ramsted's Korean grammar. Those were the very first steps I took in Korean, and it must at least in part be some tribute to Keene's qualities as a teacher that this led to my holding the first academic post in Korean in Britain, virtually in the whole Western world, and eventually in 1977 to my playing a leading role in forming the Association of Korean Studies in Europe. Kamei Takashi, a scholar of the history of the Japanese language at Hitotsubashi University, I believe, was the first lector in Japanese. He must have come in 1950 and was the first living speaking Japanese I'd ever met. That, remember, was after I had finished the Japanese tripos. Kamei was a model of what a sensei should be to his students, at least if the teacher-pupil relationship, which I came to value most highly in Korea, is applicable to Japan also. I was saddened by his telling me, when I met him again in Japan in 1955, how much he had suffered all the time he was in Cambridge from a total lack of the sort of companionship within which he could exchange jokes. Again, this may be a clue to the nature of Japanese studies there at the time. Also, local attitudes towards any Japanese at the time were distinctly hostile, fueled by the experiences of men of the Cambridgeshire Regiment in prisoner of war camps. Kamei's digs were a lonely apartment in St. Mary's Chambers. Only as I write these words do I wonder why Kamei and Keene did not have much humour to share with their views of life in England. For myself, at the time, I had thought that he and I enjoyed each other's company. Now I suppose that the greatest amusement he had at anything in England was at the curious form of my spoken Japanese. My style and vocabulary were probably essentially 8th century, with occasional modernisms from the 10th to 18th centuries. This is very good. Hmm. Joyce Ackroyd joined us for a year or so, about 1948-49, and I should surely have gained more from being with her than the pleasure I found in going round the Gog Magog course with her, which is all that sticks in the mind now. Gog Magog are two hills outside Cambridge, so no, there was one other thing. She had packed in the same case as her dictionary a bottle of Australian sherry, which had leaked away completely during the voyage. She could be abrasively argumentative, but at least it was always a pleasure to look up the words on which we disagreed in her dictionary. John McEwen was, in those days, totally devoted to his subject, and I recall as the chief characteristic of his teaching his kindliness. I wondered at the time, and still do, how he came to decline so sadly. Could the apparent unreceptiveness of his students have been a factor? Of course, Keedle insisted that our education would not be complete without classical Chinese, and our teachers of that were also in the best Cambridge tradition. Gustav Halun's flaunted Sudeten German accent was as intriguing a study as the Mencius, which he was ostensibly interpreting for us. Under him, we completed our study of the first 4 characters of Book 1 in the first term of 1948-49, which equipped us adequately to read the rest of it for ourselves in the Christmas vacation. In 1949-50, it was Bertie Davis on Chuang Tzu, or perhaps it was the Tao Te Ching. Anyway, Davies' exegesis of whatever it was called for more ingenuity in interpretation than the original Chinese texts. As if Korean and Chinese were not enough, we also had the benefit, probably in 1950-51, of Denis Sinor's teaching of Mongolian. Sinor was an Hungarian by birth who had learned, while studying in Paris, to be infinitely more French than the French, but in English too he was the most lucid of teachers. I am sure that his description of Mongolian influenced greatly my own later analysis of Korean. I would not have missed for anything my 4 years in Japanese studies at Cambridge, plus the next 4 years in which I was a frequent visitor there to see my supervisor. I have nothing but happy memories of those years, and though I may not have shown due formal respect to my teachers in these reminiscences, all of them commanded my respect at the time. My warm personal regard for them will, I hope, excuse anything I have said about them which might be taken as derogatory or offensive. The debt which I owe them for a very rewarding subsequent career in Korean studies, is enormous. The debt which Japanese studies at Cambridge owes to them, especially to Eric Keedle, will, I am sure, always be acknowledged. Well, that was rather fun and very fine. And next is Reminiscences of Cambridge by Donald Keene. The following series of extracts come from Donald Keene's book, On Familiar Terms, A Journey Across Cultures, Kodansha International 1994, with the author's kind permission. They begin at the point when Keene was studying at Harvard soon after the end of the Pacific War and decided to apply for a grant to study in England. Like the majority of his generation, his knowledge of the Japanese language was a direct result of having to learn it during the Pacific War. About halfway through my year at Harvard, I made the unpleasant discovery that I would soon exhaust my benefits under the GI Bill of Rights. I decided to look for a job teaching somewhere, but the only opening I heard of at a college in Maine was to teach the history of all civilizations. And I did not feel up to this task. Indeed not. When I went to see a professor at Columbia, who had always seemed interested in my career and asked his opinion, he examined my undergraduate record carefully and then, on the basis of my marks, suggested that I look for a job teaching Greek. This was hardly a welcome suggestion. I had not looked at a Greek text for 7 years, and I had no intention of abandoning Japanese. But obviously there were absolutely no jobs in Japanese studies. What to do? At this point, someone at Harvard told me about the Henry Fellowships that were awarded to Americans for study in England and to Englishmen for study in America. Preference was given 60 applicants who wished to study subjects that were not so well taught in their own country as in the host country. I knew nothing about the state of teaching Japanese in England, but I thought it would probably be a mistake to ask to study Japanese there, so I boldly opted for Arabic and Persian without knowing much about this either, but assuming, because of the long-standing British relations with the Middle East, that the teaching of these languages in England was superior to that in America. I wrote the usual kind of proposal, pointing out the rarity of persons whose knowledge of Asia extended from one end to the other, and implying that learning two more difficult languages was well within my capacities. Did I really mean what I wrote? There is no way for me now to recall whether I was sincere or merely opportunistic, but I believe that if, when I eventually arrived in England, I had been encouraged to study Arabic and Persian, that is exactly what I should have done. Fortunately, I was discouraged, but neither I nor the Board of Examiners before whom I appeared foresaw this. I eventually had word that I had been awarded a fellowship. My financial crisis had been solved for at least a year, and I was excited by the prospect of studying in Cambridge, even though I could not help feeling a little uncertain about the desirability of shifting my interests to Arabic and Persian. Keene left for England in September 1948 and eventually arrived via France and Holland in time for the beginning of the academic year. I took the boat at the Hook of Holland for England. I felt not only anticipation as I had before arriving in France, but also a certain tension at the thought that I would not simply be visiting, but living in England for a whole year. As a matter of fact, I was to spend 5 years there. I did not know a single person in the whole country, and I had absolutely no idea of what it would be like to study, as I planned, Arabic and Persian. Reports I had read about austerity, the discipline the British had imposed on themselves to surmount the economic crisis of the post-war years, made me wonder if I might even have to go hungry. And almost every account of post-war Britain suggested that, contrary to pre-war days when the sun never set on the British Empire, it now rained constantly. My arrival in Cambridge initially confirmed my worst fears. I had been accepted by Corpus Christi College, and when I presented myself, a gyp, a college servant, that's GYP, led me to my rooms, remarking, "Coldest rooms in Cambridge, sir." My rooms consisted of a large sitting room and an almost as large bedroom with a window that it was impossible to shut. That afternoon, the gyp brought me my daily ration of milk, about 1 inch of milk in a jug. And that night, dinner consisted of white fish with a white sauce and white potatoes and white cabbage on a white plate. I had never realized before how important color is to food. Sorry, this is very funny. The thought of a year of austerity filled me with foreboding. I had feared that the traditional reserve of the English might keep me from making friends. But within a day or two, I had developed at least a nodding acquaintance with several members of my college, and some of these eventually became friends. Although I already had an MA and was now 26, the college, reluctant to give credit for degrees obtained elsewhere, considered me still to be an undergraduate. This did not upset me, but I found myself for the first time in my life the oldest in any group. Shortly after my arrival, I was sent to a member of the Faculty of Oriental Languages to discuss my plans for studying Arabic and Persian. He asked, "How many years will you be here?" When I told him that my fellowship was for just 1 year, he smiled. "Do you think you can learn Arabic in 1 year?" he asked, "and Persian too?" "And Persian too," was my cheerful response. This, I think, was too much for him, as it would be for anyone who knew anything about those languages. He made it clear that there was no point in bothering the professor of Arabic with so presumptuous a plan. What to do? As had become usual with me in times of crisis, I fell back on the Japanese. What this meant now was that I went to see the lecturer in Japanese, Eric Keedle. He advised me to study classical Chinese with Professor Gustav Halun and suggested that I might also help in the teaching of Japanese. Both suggestions were immediately accepted, and I was grateful for them. Although I had found the pace of studying the Chinese classics at Columbia much too slow for me immediately after my wartime experiences, I seemed to have matured somewhat, and I came to enjoy the late afternoon sessions of reading Chuang Tzu with Professor Halun and 4 or 5 other students. We gathered not in a classroom, but in the professor's living room, where we were diverted by a cat named Pluto and an asthmatic grandfather clock that struck the hours only after a long, protracted wheeze. Wonderful. I did the first teaching of my life at Cambridge that autumn. Once a week, I held a session of Japanese conversation with three undergraduates. I had not spoken Japanese for almost 3 years, and no doubt my Japanese had become rather rusty, but there was not a single real Japanese in Cambridge. Only one of the three students had ever actually spoken Japanese at whatever level. The other two had begun their Japanese, as was then the practice in Cambridge, though this practice has long since been discontinued, with the preface to the 10th century collection of poetry, Kokinshu. In terms of the traditional British education in the classics, it was normal to study a language like Latin or Greek that one would not attempt to speak. Beginning instruction in Japanese with the preface to the Kokinshu was entirely in keeping with that tradition. The vocabulary of the preface is restricted, very few kanji are used, and the grammar is absolutely regular. Only after the student had obtained a firm grasp of classical Japanese was he introduced in his second year to the modern language. Well, Keene had been an interpreter in his wartime role in the US Army, I think it was. So he would have spoken Japanese at least during the war on a serious business work basis. This system was logical in terms of pedagogy, but it made for the most peculiar conversation hours. The students mingled Heian period phrases with colloquialisms picked up from me or elsewhere, rather as if a Japanese had learned his English conversation from a combination of Beowulf and Ernest Hemingway. I was not a great success as a teacher, but in spite of me, two of my three students went on to have distinguished academic careers. And toward the end of the year, Professor Haloon asked me if I would not consider remaining in Cambridge as a member of the faculty. I remember the day very well. It was a sunny day of a kind one rarely encounters in February. Aconites and snowdrops were in bloom here and there, proclaiming the coming of spring. I went for a walk to clear my thoughts. I had already accepted a position as an assistant professor at an American university, a job far more elevated than the assistant lectureship that was the most I could expect at Cambridge. The salary offered by the American institution was also about 5 times as much as assistant lecturers were paid. In material terms, there was no comparison between the two positions, but I felt extremely reluctant to leave Cambridge. Cambridge had brought my first acquaintance with living traditions. At first, it seemed strange, for example, to wear an academic gown in the manner of students of long ago, and I remember my irritation when I was denied entry to the university library because I was not wearing a gown. But gradually this costume, worn in America only at graduation ceremonies, became a part of my life. I enjoyed seeing undergraduates in gowns, sometimes tattered, on their way to chapel or dinner, and hearing the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path outside my window. It gave me a sense of tradition, too, when I saw at night 2 officers of the university patrolling the streets on the lookout for undergraduates who were not wearing gowns. These men carried with them, as the source of their authority, a copy of university regulations framed a century earlier. Nothing dreadful would happen to an undergraduate caught not wearing a gown. Wearing a gown was in fact a privilege rather than a duty, and not wearing one a pleasantly dangerous activity. A body of legends had grown up about night climbers, undergraduates who had boldly defied regulations and returned to their rooms in college late at night without gowns or permission by scaling walls and spiked fences. I also enjoyed eating in hall, as the college dining room is called. The food was terrible. Whale meat was, I think, the worst thing served, but there were other nearly as unpalatable dishes, all of which were listed on the menu with elegant French names. There was extremely little variety. One week, as I noted at the time, of 21 meals eaten in hall during the course of a week, 14 had herring as their chief ingredient. Oh, my Lord. Years later, when in Kyoto for the first time, I blanched when invited to eat nishin soba noodles with herring. But Hall itself was a splendid building, ornamented by the portraits of long ago masters of the college. I enjoyed too hearing grace said before meals each night in Latin by members of the high table, the dons of the college. In short, I had developed such a strong attachment to Cambridge, even during this period of drab austerity, that I was not much tempted by California sunshine. As I walked along that day in February, the college buildings had never seemed more splendid. I went into the library of Trinity College and examined the mementos of what seemed to be half the great men of England. I thought, I can't leave this place. The thought became a firm conviction as I walked back to my rooms in college, and that night I wrote a letter to the American University asking to be released from my promise to teach there. I had made a decision that would directly affect the next 5 years of my life, the years spent in Cambridge. My remembrances of my first year in Cambridge are mainly of my pleasure in the architecture and atmosphere. I enjoyed even the nights in November when yellow fog stung my eyes because they recalled the descriptions I had read of the London fog. England gave me a feeling of homecoming, not in terms of ancestors, but of English literature. To hear a cuckoo for the first time, or to go to a place known for its nightingales, was not simply enjoyable, but created a link between myself and the poetry that spoke of these birds. I enjoyed also the sounds of English as pronounced by my new friends. In recent years, I understand regional accents have come to be accepted, but at that time, any undergraduate who did not speak the language appropriate to his privileged station would be urged to attend a school where he might improve his speech. I myself tried to speak as much like an Englishman as possible. This was not very difficult, and it enabled me to feel that I belonged in Cambridge, but sometimes it only earned me such sarcasm as, "How is it that you and Americans can speak English?" Unpleasant comments about Americans formed part of the normal conversation of some of the people I met. It was annoying at first to be asked such questions as, "Is it true that American universities grant doctorates in dishwashing?" I gradually realized that there was generally nothing more than a pleasantry involved in these queries. The contrast between the austerity of life in Britain and the opulence of American life as depicted in the films must have been irritating to people brought up to the strains of rural Britannia, and the brain drain of scholars to America was no doubt a reminder of the changes that had occurred in the comparative economic strength of the two countries. It would have been strange if there had been no resentment, but the courtesy of the British, far more than such momentary irritations, lingers in my memory. During the winter vacation in 1948, my rooms in college were to be used by students taking examinations, and I decided to go to Rome, where I knew some people from the ship that had taken me to Europe. I had completed writing my doctoral dissertation, The Battles of Coxinga, Coxinga, while in Cambridge, and I decided to type it in Rome. I went first to Paris, then took an overnight train to Milan. The compartment was stuffy, and I thought I would take advantage of the wait in Milan to get some fresh air. I asked another passenger in the compartment if he would look after my suitcase and typewriter, and I then walked up and down the platform briskly for perhaps 5 minutes. When I returned to the compartment, there was no man and no suitcase. At first, I couldn't believe it. I thought that it must be a nightmare from which I would presently awake. I went to the police and, in my poor Italian, explained what had happened. I urged them to look for the man, who must still be in the station, but they laughed at my guilelessness and insisted that I complete a form, name of father, name of mother, names of grandparents, profession of father, and so on. By this time I was almost hysterical, but there was absolutely nothing I could do. I never saw the manuscript of my dissertation again. I returned to Cambridge with nothing but the few clothes I had bought in Italy. I was shaken by the disaster, but it led to the formation of my most important friendship in England. It was still the Christmas vacation when I got back to Cambridge, and there were very few people in the college. I told everyone I met of the disaster that had overtaken me in Milan. This seemed to be the only way of dissipating even slightly my frustration. The response was heartwarming. One person arranged for me to stay in a warm and comfortable room that was empty during the vacation. Another found me a typewriter on which to write a new version of the stolen dissertation. One of the few friends who was actually in Cambridge at the time, William Dickens, was the son of one of the dons at Corpus Christi College. His mother, by way of expressing her sympathy, invited me for lunch, and the invitation was extended day after day until the college kitchen started to function again. It was no small favour to invite a guest to meals during those days of rationing, and I was profoundly grateful. More than that, Mrs. Mary Dickens became a close friend, a relationship that lasted until her death. She was the eldest of the 5 daughters of Sir Herbert Grierson, the great scholar of English literature. Her sisters, all of whom were exceptionally interesting women, lived in Oxford, The Hague, New York, and Paris. They had grown up in a household where scraps of poetry were used as a kind of shorthand communication, it being assumed that the relevance of the quotations to the situation at hand would immediately be understood. I confess that I did not always recognize the quotations, but that hardly mattered. It was exciting to talk with anyone from whom ideas tumbled so rapidly that ordinary prose could not keep up the pace. Among Mrs. Dickens's achievements was that of being a great cook. She was able to find ways of preparing delicious meals from items such as sheep's heads that were not rationed because almost no one knew how to cook them. Years later, when she decided to live independently, her skill as a cook was recognized by higher and higher levels of employers until she was finally cooking for the royal family at Balmoral. One of the many subjects we talked about one of the many subjects we talked about, painting, seemed closest to her heart. Sometimes we went to galleries together. It was her practice to look at only 1 or 2 pictures during a visit, but to stay before each until she felt she really understood it. She had no interest in what was merely decorative. Unless a painting spoke to her directly, she soon moved on. I recall that when I went with her to the Frick collection in New York, she seemed to absorb into herself the great El Greco portrait of St. Jerome. Only then did she give me the benefit of her perceptions of what El Greco wished to reveal in the portrait. Or at the Metropolitan Museum, she stopped before a Goya showing 2 women who sit on a balcony, smiling down on the scene before them, while a third person, somberly dressed, looks away. Mrs. Dickens instinctively felt that the women were watching an execution. I have no idea whether or not Goya in fact intended to suggest this, but it made perfect sense to me. I suppose that one definition of a friend is someone with whom one always has something to talk about. That was certainly true of Mrs. Dickens. After my first year in college, I lived in her house for 2 years, and although we met at mealtimes every day, there never seemed to be enough time for all we both had to say. I managed, thanks to my friends in Cambridge, to rewrite the dissertation that spring. One friend who had read both the old and new versions told me that the new one was a great improvement. Perhaps he was only trying to comfort me. Even more important than his praise was the friendship with Mrs. Dickens that had stemmed from my loss. Perhaps I should really have thanked the thief in Milan. The one person I wanted most to meet in England, even before I left America, was Arthur Waley. His translations of Japanese and Chinese literature had been my inspiration during the long years of learning to read these languages. I still have somewhere a copy of his More Translations from the Chinese, with the Chinese texts laboriously and clumsily copied in my hand at a time when I was groping ahead in the dark toward the light that was Waley. For some years I had thought, before I realized my own limitations, that I would imitate Waley in being a scholar of both China and Japan. However, though I admired his translations of Chinese poetry so much, I had memorized some. I had never been able to read through his translation of the Chinese novel Monkey, though some people enjoy it most of all his works. This made me think again that perhaps I was cut out to be only half of Waley. I preferred his translations from the Japanese, and sometimes I tried to persuade myself that he really liked Japanese literature better than Chinese. He once told me that his partial translation of the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon was his own favorite among his works. I had been moved especially by the beauty of his translation of the Tale of Genji, a marvelous recreation in English of a text 1,000 years old. During the war, I had tried to read the original in a class at the University of Hawaii, and this painful experience had aroused renewed admiration, even awe, for Waley's accomplishment. I had been told before leaving America that Waley worked at the British Museum, but this had not been true for many years. As I was wondering how to meet him, I learned in January 1949 that he was to lecture in Cambridge and wrote inviting him to tea. I had no introduction, and only an ironclad desire to meet him can explain what gave me the courage to offer this invitation. Whaley replied with a postcard, the message written in minuscule handwriting at the top, saying that I should introduce myself after his lecture. That afternoon, I was listening to a broadcast from Germany of a Wagnerian opera when there was a knock on my door. "Come in," I shouted unceremoniously, and an unknown man entered. "I am Dr. Whaley," the man said. In great confusion, I switched off the radio and stammered something about having been studying. I heard later from a friend with whom Whaley subsequently spoke that he had been astonished that anyone could study to the beat of American jazz. I was miserable at the thought that Whaley had formed a bad impression of me, and was sure he would never be able to take seriously anyone with such uncouth habits. Only later did I realize that my best qualification for being accepted as an acquaintance by this great collector of eccentrics was as the American who could study only to the raucous accompaniment of jazz. His lecture that night was on the Ainu epic Kutune Shirka. All I knew about the Ainu was the stereotype of the hairy Ainu, but Whaley's rendering of the epic made me realize that they had composed delicate and beautiful poetry. He read aloud in a rather high-pitched voice, interrupting himself occasionally to make some comment on the poetry, which he obviously loved. The possibility of discovering another variety of poetry had induced him to study the Ainu language, though he was of an age when learning a new language is by no means easy. In the years that followed, I visited Whaley from time to time in London. I have met people who complained that they could never get a word out of Whaley, but we always found topics of mutual interest, and sometimes we sat in his room talking until it became too dark even to see each other. Not long after I had firmly committed myself to teaching in Cambridge, the pound was devalued by about a third. My modest salary in terms of dollars became insufficient even to sustain life, to the consternation of family and friends in America. But as a matter of fact, I have no recollection of having suffered because of lack of money. Almost every item of food was rationed at a price that was calculated to the farthing, a quarter of a penny. Meals in restaurants never cost more than 5 shillings, though fancy establishments might add charges for such items as flowers on the table. Tickets to plays and concerts were still cheap enough for me to go regularly. In all the time I was in Cambridge, I never heard of the existence of a black market, though perhaps this academic community was not typical of the entire country. The only time I felt the strain of austerity was when, during vacations, I went abroad. The allowance for foreign currency was £25 a year, hardly enough for travel to France, Spain, and Italy, the countries I wanted most to visit. All the same, I managed to go abroad almost every vacation without breaking any laws. My teaching consisted mainly of reading classical texts with 2 or 3 students. I can remember only 2. Hojoki, which I would read with students at Columbia for about 30 years, and Kojiki, which I never read again. My one crisis as a teacher occurred during my second year of teaching. I was informed that if I wished to be promoted from assistant lecturer to lecturer, I would have to teach a second Asian language. I had studied Chinese for almost as much time as Japanese and suggested I might be able to teach that language, but I was told that the teaching of Chinese traditionally on the model of Hebrew could not be combined with the teaching of any other language. Was there not some other Oriental language I might teach? After some thought, I answered that during the war I had learned a little Korean, mainly from prisoners of war. Excellent, was the response. Nobody will ever want to study Korean, and Korean goes well with Japanese like Arabic with Persian. In this manner, I became the lecturer in Japanese and Korean. The next summer, the Korean War broke out, and in the autumn, when the university year began, I had 7 students in my Korean class, most of them persons senior to myself. I could not very well admit my virtual ignorance of the Korean language. Instead, I pored over the one book that was of help, a textbook of Korean grammar by a Finnish scholar. I also had a Korean-Japanese dictionary that I had picked up during the war. The text we read had been prepared at an American university, but was not accompanied by any teaching materials. The questions asked by my students were penetrating, each one seemingly designed to destroy the weak fabric of my self-confidence. Sometimes, when asked the meaning of a verb ending or a particle that I did not know, I resorted to the desperate expedient of saying that it was only a meaningless sound. I really don't know how I got through that year, but one of the students went on to become a scholar of Korean, and I now think of myself once in a while as the father of Korean studies in Great Britain. I was otherwise occupied with preparing for publication the battles of Koxinga, and in the following year I published the Japanese discovery of Europe. I decided then and there to publish a book every year, a resolution I found increasingly difficult to implement. My first book, The Battles of Koxinga, was published in 1951. I was in Istanbul, attending the Congress of Orientalists at the time of publication, and looked forward to my return to England, imagining I would see copies of my book in the windows of the bookshops in Cambridge. Alas, the book never made a window anywhere, and I can hardly recall ever having seen a copy on sale. It was reviewed in a few specialist periodicals and then left to disappear into the great void of unread books. Many young scholars have had the same experience, but nothing can prepare one or console one for the shock of having, with immense effort and expenditure of time, produced a book that no one wants to read. I marvel now that this experience did not make me decide never to publish another book, but perhaps I have forgotten now. A spirit of never say die impelled me to write a book that would really be read and respected. My life in Cambridge was in most ways ideal for a scholar. My teaching load was light, and the vacations totaled more than 6 months each year. The collection of Japanese books in the university library, at first restricted to the rare editions of the Tokugawa period given to the library by Aston and other pioneers in the domain of Japanese studies, such as Ernest Sato, I would say, had now been much augmented by purchases of modern books, and it was clearly adequate for my needs. Certainly adequate for my needs. I had friends like Mrs. Dickens in Cambridge and a few others elsewhere in England. In France and Spain, I also had friends who made it possible for me to spend much longer periods in those countries than my annual allotment of foreign currency would otherwise have permitted. I knew how fortunate I was, and yet I sometimes felt discontented and depressed. Probably the main cause of my discontent was my lack of satisfaction with my work as a teacher. After the initial excitement of the Korean War, which brought me the largest class I was ever to have at Cambridge, had died down, I went back to teaching classes of 1 or 2 students. If these students had been absolutely first-rate, they might have inspired me and persuaded me that I was fulfilling the traditional function of a teacher, passing on the torch of learning. The students were certainly pleasant and intelligent, but not extraordinary, and giving formal lectures to 2 people was frustrating. Like many others who have devoted themselves to the study of Japan, I had something of the propagandist in me. I wanted to communicate my enthusiasm for Japanese literature to others, the more the better, and 2 students failed to satisfy me. The general lack of interest in my books was equally depressing. I had a statement from the publishers of my first book, The Battles of Koxinga, to the effect that at the present rate of sales it would take 72 years to exhaust the edition of 1,000 copies. Oh dear. The Japanese discovery of Europe had been somewhat more favorably received, but I never met anyone in the university who had actually read it. I did not realize at the time that this was normal in academic communities. And although I was still very much in love with Cambridge and its traditions, I was rather afraid of becoming like some of the scholars I knew, men who had published a brilliant book before they were 30 and nothing since. I learned not to ask, as one habitually did in America, what a scholar was working on, for fear of receiving an answer such as, "I've written my book." Again, I enjoyed dining with the dons at the high table in Corpus Christi College, where a valiant attempt was made, despite the rationing, to maintain some of the elegance of pre-war days. After the meal, when we went to the combination room to drink port or Madeira, I would sometimes try the snuff that was passed around in a silver box, gingerly imitating the others. I never derived the least pleasure from snuff, not even a good sneeze, but I was eager to participate in all the traditional rites. The avoidance of shop talk on such occasions always depressed me. What, I wondered, could be more interesting than shop talk with the scholars around the table? And what was less interesting than chit-chat on projected repairs to the college buildings or the current state of the benefice made by some 18th century donor? I can hardly remember one topic of conversation worthy of the learned men around me. Obviously, I was becoming restive, but having made up my mind to spend the rest of my life in Cambridge, it did not occur to me that I might be happier elsewhere. In the spring of 1952, I offered a series of lectures on Japanese literature at Cambridge University. The frustration I had begun to feel over the fewness of my students and the general lack of interest in my work had made me try to think of some way of arousing interest in my subject and satisfying my vaguely sensed desire to be a real teacher. It occurred to me that a series of lectures, open not only to everyone in the university but to the town as well, might be the best solution to my problem. I prepared 5 lectures, trying to make them as interesting and intelligible as possible. Apart from the introductory lecture, in which I presented my impressions of the characteristics of Japanese literature as a whole, I gave 1 lecture each on poetry, theatre, fiction, and finally, what I called Japanese literature under Western influence. When I think back on these lectures now, I marvel at my daring in having ventured to present my views on a literature that I had first begun to read less than 10 years earlier. But reading the book that resulted now, I see that what I lacked in knowledge, I made up for in enthusiasm. I feel most dissatisfied now with the last lecture. I would not call it Japanese literature under Western influence if I wrote it today, because I am aware of how much in modern literature cannot be explained in terms of influence from the West. At the time, however, it was almost impossible to obtain books from Japan, and the Japanese collection of the university library, though well provided with works of classical literature, had extremely few modern novels. Arthur Whaley gave me the copy of Sasame Yuki, the Makioka sisters, that the author Tanizaki Junichiro had sent him, and this together with Ukigumo by Hayashi Fumiko were the only post-war works of fiction that I knew and discussed in my lecture. On the day of the first lecture, I waited nervously outside the hall for the first time when the lecture was scheduled to begin. A young woman came up to me and asked if this was where the lecture on Japanese literature was to be given. I told her that it was. "Do you think it will be good?" she asked. I was too embarrassed to say anything, and to my disappointment she went away. When the hour finally arrived, I went inside. I saw that I had been given a very large lecture room, but that there were no more than 10 people, all seated in a row. Of course, Mrs. Dickens was there, as was Professor Dickens. Most of the other people present were acquaintances, probably there out of a sense of duty, or else more knowledgeable in such matters than I, aware how few listeners were likely to assemble and anxious to spare me wounded feelings. The audience for each of the 5 lectures ranged from 6 to 10 people, huddled together in a room that could easily have accommodated 200. I was thoroughly discouraged. I had put into the lectures not only all of my imperfect knowledge of Japanese literature, but my youthful love of my subject, and I felt rejected. I decided at this point to abandon Japanese, and I began in the autumn of 1952 to attend classes in Russian with the intention of shifting, at some future date, from Japanese to Russian literature. Fortunately or unfortunately, I made absolutely no progress with Russian. I had no trouble with the grammar, but the vocabulary refused to enter my brain. I concluded sadly that I was bound to Japanese for life. Donald Keene resigned his post at Cambridge in the autumn of 1954 to return to Columbia University as a professor. Columbia was prepared to give him a longer spell of leave in Japan than Cambridge could bring itself to contemplate. Did anyone realize at the time the loss that this would represent? That, I think, is the end of Donald Keene's contribution. And then the next one is The Next 30 Years by Carmen Blacker. But I think I will stop here and possibly continue at a later time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly found some of it rather funny, as you probably noticed. Very interesting and slightly quirky accounts of some fairly challenging days, the early days of Japanese studies at Cambridge University. And with that, I think I shall close the video and hope to see you again soon. Goodbye now.